Thanks be to God. Thanks be to God. Thanks be to God. Please be seated. Most of you know this story by now. I tend to repeat the same stuff over and over again, but here we go. One of the best known of the Desert Fathers from the 4th century, Saint Serapion, it's a great name, by the way, he once set out from Egypt and he traveled all the way to Rome on a pilgrimage. And when he got to Rome, somebody there told him about a woman who was even more of a recluse, even more of a hermit than he was. I mean, after all, Saint Serapion, he was a monk who spent most of his time praying in the solitude of the desert. Like, it doesn't get much more reclusive than that, right? That's pretty much the definition of a hermit. But at least he ventured out on occasion to go on epic long pilgrimages to Rome, for example, right? But this woman that he heard about in Rome, he heard that she spent her entire life in one tiny little room, much like Julian of Norwich, for those of you who are familiar with her. This woman never ventured out of that tiny little room. And so Saint Serapion was skeptical about her way of life, and he sought her out, and when he found her, he interrupted her prayers, and he asked, "Hey lady, why are you just sitting here?" Do you know her response? Can you intuit her reply? In your deepest moments in life, I'm pretty sure her reply is also your reply. Somebody said it over here. I am not just sitting here, she said. I am on a great journey. My friends, Christianity is not mainly an institution or a religion. Christianity is not mainly a worldview or a belief system or an ideology or a doctrine or a political movement or even a fellowship of like-minded spiritual people. Christianity is not mainly a social justice movement or an ethical code of conduct. No, Christianity is a great journey. The greatest of all journeys, even. An adventure of deep self-awakening. I mean, think about this. Jesus didn't come into this world to impart a new religion or a new dogma or a new doctrine or a theology to his disciples. Like, he didn't hand down textbooks or letters and say, study them thoroughly, a pop quiz is coming, right? He didn't do any of that. No, he simply invited people to follow him. Follow me, he said. He has invited all of us to accompany him on this great adventure of life, this great journey that he is on. And so we journey with Jesus through the church calendar, through the lectionary, through all of the different readings, through all of the different liturgical seasons. We follow him from Advent all the way through to Pentecost. And our journey begins with the anticipation of Christ's birth in a manger in Bethlehem, but the journey culminates with Christ's birth in the manger that is the human heart. We journey out of the Egypt of the traumatized subconscious into the promised land of mental rest and peace. We journey out of the old creation into the new creation. We journey away from the Golgotha of the false self, and we ascend the Mount Tabor of the true transfigured self. We journey away from inner stagnation into an all-encompassing transformation. And on this journey, the ego is crucified, and Christ consciousness comes walking out of an empty tomb. We journey from the dark cloud of Sinai into the festal fire that is Mount Zion. You are not just sitting here. You are on a great journey. For you are journeying from your baptism to this Eucharist. You're journeying away from the old self into the new self, journeying away from death into life. You are journeying into the very depths of your heart, into the very place where Christ himself has culminated his great journey. You're journeying into the very place where God now finds his rest. For this Eucharist is the roadmap into your heart. Everything in this space, everything in our ritualism, everything in this Eucharist depicts the heart's union with God. The Lord be with you.
And also with
Lift up your hearts. At the climax of this Eucharistic service, you move from the space down there that represents material reality, the earth. You move from the space that symbolizes, that actually is material reality. And you move up to this space that symbolizes, that actually is the Holy of Holies, a sacred space. Another way of thinking about it, this altar rail is your heart, the place where you and the divine are one. To kneel at this altar rail is to descend into your own heart, to descend into your own union with God. In receiving this bread and this wine, you are receiving the substance of your very being, the Logos, which grounds your very existence, the very presence that makes your heart tick, the very presence that breathes the breath of life into your lungs. You are not just sitting here. You are on a great journey. The journey into the kingdom of God that is within you. As St. Macarius said hundreds and hundreds of years ago, the heart is only a small vessel, yet God is there, and so are the angels. Life is there in the kingdom. There too is light, and there are the apostles, and all the inhabitants of heaven, and all treasures of grace. All things lie within that tiny little space. Or as St. Isaac the Syrian once said, also hundreds and hundreds of years ago, enter your inner treasure house, and you'll see the treasure house of heaven. For both the one and the other are the same, and one and the same entrance reveals them both. The ladder leading to the kingdom of God is concealed within you. Now, of course, the question is, how do we find our way into our hearts? For most of us, we live with a duality between heart and mind, between spirit and body. How do we bridge the gap? How do we find our way into our hearts? How do we live from our hearts? How do we unlock the kingdom of God that is within us? How do we discover the Holy of Holies that rests at the center of each and every single one of us? How do we awaken to our union with the divine? The answer is Eucharist. Thanksgiving is the journey. Gratefulness is the way. Thanks be to God. Thanks be to God. Thanks be to God. The Lord be with you. Lift up your hearts. Let us give thanks. As St. Paul says this morning, Theo charis, thanks be to God, that you, having once been slaves to sin, in other words, another way of saying it, you once were slaves to self-destruction, slaves to self-sabotage, slaves to harmful habits, slaves to addiction, slaves to the false self, slaves to the ego. But now you have become obedient from your heart to the form of teaching to which you were entrusted, that was handed down to you, this sacred tradition that we have. And what is this form of tradition, this form of teaching that your heart is now obedient to? Eucharist, thankfulness, thanksgiving, this journey into the heart, the journey to uncover the presence of Christ within you. And now you, having been set free from sin, from self-sabotage, from all of this stuff, have become slaves to righteousness. In other words, now you can't but help but be more righteous than you were before. Because now you can't help but live from this Christ presence that is within you. Before, you lived only from your addiction, only from your selfish desires, only from your self-sabotaging ways. But now you live from your heart. Theocharis. Thanks be to God. What did Paul say? It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Theocharis. Thanks be to God. I am everything that Christ has become, and Christ is everything that I will become one day. Theocharis. Thanks be to God. Because you are not just sitting here. You are on the greatest of journeys.